quick slideshow before the video. I got this Metasequoia from a guy in Pennsylvania over a year ago. He was kind enough to chop it up like this and mail it to me, and this is how it looked when I laid out the whole big slab in my carport. I was working outside back then. I didn't really have a workshop. My plan was to grow Metasequoia trees and take these slabs and make bonsai tables and sell them as a package deal. And I also got these Metasequoia fossils, got some twigs and leaves and a fossilized cone. And I was kind of thinking about how to put them together. First I thought sticking up like that might look good, but it just looked awkward. So I finally decided on this configuration. And I played around with the idea of a two-tiered bonsai table, but I discarded that idea for the time being and just slapped an oil finish on the larger piece there and let it cure inside all winter. So enjoy the video in which I discover that the best way to work with Metasequoia is in a padded room with no sharp objects, which is exactly where you will end up if you work with Metasequoia for too long. I took it with me when I moved several states away and got a workshop. And the first step has to be removing the finish. I looked at a couple of articles online, a couple of YouTube videos. They had some tips for mixing together various solvents like paint thinner and so on. Nothing really worked. In the end, I decided to just sand it off the old-fashioned way. Did some now and left some for later, because there's no time like the future. I'm resurrecting the idea of a second tier on this table. And the reason is that this has gone from being something that I was planning on selling to a gift for a coworker. He knows it's coming. It's quite a bit overdue, but there's been a lot going on lately. Now, we don't work together anymore. We don't even live in the same state. We've both moved on from that place, but during the last year or so that we were there, he really saved us a lot of trouble. It covered some things during horrible weather catastrophes, and fed my cats during my honeymoon. So I figured that instead of giving him one of the basic models of this Metasequoia bonsai table, I would do a bit extra. Not just with the fossils, but with some pyrography. And, well, when I started this, I wasn't really sure where it was going. What was obvious was that both of these pieces had gotten a little warped. This wood is... It looks very interesting. It looks pink. It's also very light. It's like working with balsa. It's like balsa or basswood or somewhere in between. I've read that it's used occasionally for construction in China. I can't imagine that would have a favorable outcome. But I just shaved right over that knot and didn't even feel it. Now, the job that I did for about 3.5 years. He was there for a bit longer. It was very stressful. It wasn't just the work that was stressful. It was a stressful environment. And it was the type of job that really takes a lot out of you. Like I was telling someone a couple of weeks ago who used to be a deputy and left that job. It's the type of job where sometimes you just go home and stare at the wall because of the things that people do to each other. But on that note, let's take a break to check out how interesting the structure of this wood is. It looks, you can see some of the pink color. It looks prehistoric. It doesn't. It looks ancient compared to any other species that I've planed. And I know, all trees are, ancient compared to us, but it's fitting that I think that it should look like that. It looks almost reptilian. But the Metasequoia, or dawn redwood, as some call it, was believed to be extinct. I've got some tear out. I thought that since I ran right over that other knot, that one would be just as much of a pushover, but it put up some resistance. And I'm missing a chunk now. But anyway, the reason why it looks so prehistoric is because it's considered to be a living fossil, and per Wikipedia, Metasequoia has experienced morphological stasis for the past 65 million years. The modern Metasequoia glyptostroboides appears identical to its late Cretaceous ancestors. Now, it used to be found all over the northern hemisphere. The story is that the fossil version was discovered in 1939, and then 2 years later, in 1941, a grove of these trees was discovered in central China. And it took a couple of years before, in 1948, they finally put it together and realized that the living species that they hadn't identified, or they had considered to be a new species, was actually the same as this fossil. Now, the leaves are interesting. It's not an evergreen. It looks kind of like the leaves of a yew tree, like a European or English yew. But it's not an evergreen. The leaves fall off and regrow every year. Now, because of that tear out, I had been wondering if I should leave the front edge of the lower part straight and plain, or if I should try to do something more interesting with it. And that tear out kind of answered the question for me. So I'm going to do a curve, and I figured I would try to match that on the upper level. So have to sharpen my cabinet scrapers and see if that'll make a dent in it. But this wood, it's difficult to work with. You can see around that knot there's a lot of tear out. It's like it's very crumbly. It's like working with feta. It's like trying to chisel and scrape a block of dry feta cheese. It's really frustrating. On the one hand, it's easy to carve. You can practically carve and shape it with 80 grit sandpaper. On the other hand, you can dent it with your fingernail or a little piece of dirt on your workbench or something. And that's true of a lot of wood species. But I mean, you can really dent it just by accidentally nicking it with your fingernail. So my idea, once I, got the curve going, was to do a bit of pyrography with the name of the species here, Metasequoia glyptostroboides. And I also have a printout of the fossil, so I'm trying to match it up with the curve and seeing how it looks. And you can see just how easily that rasp goes straight through the wood. It does not take long. This is probably a good time to introduce the book for this video. I started this channel with the intent of including some discussion of a book for every video, or at least the longer ones like this one. And for the first video, well, there's a bit of pressure, I suppose. I ultimately decided to go with one that was on the bookshelf when I was growing up. It is entitled Memories and Visions of Paradise, Exploring the Universal Myth of a Lost Golden Age by Richard Heinberg, who was actually Emanuel Velikovsky's research assistant for a few days before Velikovsky died. And Heinberg then went on to edit a few of his manuscripts, which were then published. My copy is first edition, 1989, published by Jeremy P. Tarcher, Incorporated, Los Angeles. Now, he begins with a few quotes, including one by Tacitus. The most ancient human beings lived with no evil desires, without guilt or crime, and therefore without penalties or compulsions. Nor was there any need of rewards, since by the prompting of their own nature they followed righteous ways. Since nothing contrary to morals was desired, nothing was forbidden through fear. I need to hollow out this knot a bit more. Heinberg is a little bit new agey. The book, as you may have guessed from the title, is a little bit new agey. He spends most of it really compiling his sources and rendering his thesis that there was, at the edge of recorded history or well beyond it, a golden age, a more or less utopian way of existence which encompassed the earth and all of humanity, and that this is expressed in the myths of people around the world. This would be the Garden of Eden in the Abrahamic tradition, and there are many other examples from around the world. So the book is essentially a work of comparative mythology, and to that end, it's pretty well researched. He is well-read. Heinberg is, unlike a lot of New Agey types, he's not an airhead. He's not an idiot. He did do quite a bit of research for this, and it's really only towards the end where he starts moving towards that idea that this such a golden age might come about again, which is contrary to the predominant attitude among doctrinal believers in the Abrahamic traditions, and I would have to count myself in opposition to this idea. He does speed up a bit towards the end, towards that conclusion or supposition or prescription. Sorry to ruin the ending, but he says, "Perhaps if we are willing to become partners once again with heaven and nature in the realization of an already existing design that transcends self-centered human purposes, then memory and vision may converge in a realized paradise in which the tensions that presently bedevil us, tensions between humanity and nature, heart and mind, may be dissolved in a universal spirit of accord. If we can hear and obey a voice from the timeless source of myths and dreams, there may open before us an age not of technologically engineered comfort and prosperity, but of miraculous beginnings, a new creation time. And perhaps it is only the mysterious power of creation itself that will permit us to survive and at last to fully live." That sounds nice in the way that the words of the speech of, I guess, a hippie politician might sound nice, but it doesn't. The last sentence does not appear to make any sense. And perhaps it is only the mysterious power of creation itself that will permit us to survive and at last to fully live. I mean, it sounds like it's saying something, but it's ultimately, I think it's just a platitude, which is strange and disappointing for a book that has taken so much time to build its case. And I think the fact that that landing cannot be stuck is really evidence in favor of the idea that achieving some kind of new golden age or utopia is not possible. Because the problem with this book is that it's not bad. It's pretty well researched. It's well written. It's only really in that last paragraph, and especially the last sentence, that the concerto ends on a sour note. It would be almost bizarre if it weren't so telling about the impossibility of such a conclusion. And to truly begin to rebut the last paragraph, I will use the first from the introduction. Early all human endeavors, from the search for better jobs and more fulfilling relationships to the founding of nations and the pursuit of technological and social progress, can be seen as expressions of a primal longing for an ultimate state of happiness and fulfillment. This longing, which fires the passions of each generation, can be traced back through the earliest expressions of the human imagination in literature and folklore to the primordial memory of an original paradise where human beings lived in innocent and miraculous harmony with nature and cosmos. The paradisal image still beckons us with a power and insistence that are truly archetypal, yet its source and meaning are nevertheless mysterious. Like a forgotten hypnotic suggestion, it compels our behavior, but itself remains obscure. We have this longing for an original paradise where human beings lived in innocent and miraculous harmony. Now, the problem with this is that innocence is the state of not having done something or experienced something or not being aware of something. And if that is changed, if it is broken, it can't be undone. You can't become innocent again. You can't undo an experience or an action or become unaware of something of which you've become aware. You may have heard how wood crackles as it is pried off, but until you've heard this wood being pried off and crackling, you couldn't really imagine exactly how it would sound, and you could describe it to somebody else. But they also wouldn't really be able to imagine it exactly. They wouldn't have a memory of it unless they had heard it, like you. It would help in imagining the sound if you had heard pine or walnut or some other species crackling like that, but it wouldn't be the same. These are unique experiences, and you can't unhave them Any suggestion of reacquiring a kind of collective innocence really runs counter to entropy, to individual and collective experience, which will increase and expand and become more varied unless there are fewer people. Now, of course, if there were fewer people, those people would still continue experiencing things. But what I'm suggesting is that if you want to restore innocence, as it is suggested by the people who would like to return to this golden age, there is really only one mechanism by which you might do so, and that mechanism is cataclysm. Surely Heinberg was aware of this possibility because he was Immanuel Velikovsky's research assistant and then edited his manuscripts. Velikovsky is, of course, one of the progenitors of modern catastrophism, or catastrophism, as some say. His Worlds in Collision laid much of the groundwork for many of the modern theories that are coming around and in development right now regarding the history of the Earth, the solar system, the galaxy, and possible events in the future. I'm not going to comment on that here, but I may do one of Velikovsky's other books, Ages in Chaos, and another video. But back on topic, he quotes Lewis Mumford, actually from Mumford's better book, The Myth of the Machine, where he talks about Neolithic archaeological sites and the apparent lack of weapons, although they obviously had tools and other implements. Mumford actually wrote a book called The Story of Utopias about 45 years before that, in which he made he still possessed basically the same central conceit as Heinberg. To be hopefully more concise, the people who promulgate this idea that we can return to this lost golden age or resurrect it, they tend to fall into one of two camps. They are either of the New Age type, that is, they are kind of wooey, spiritual indigo children, or they are the technocrats, or your average materialist, because that is basically the cultural project under which we have been operating for a few hundred years now. It might not be explicit, we might not see it as the overarching theme of our everyday lives, but this idea of constant technological improvement is, it was a bit more explicit in eras like the 1950s in the West, especially America. The primitivists who, want to do this for themselves or their commune are really not in the same league as those two main groups. And there is also some overlap between those groups as well. But in both cases, they presume that we, or people like us, would or could or should be the ones who will be achieving this golden age. And I'm arguing that it's the opposite, that in order for such a thing to happen, well, it would have to be different people who had not experienced what we've experienced. We can improve some things. Everyone wants to make a better world for their children. You even have these, stories of people who, used to be a cartel member or a gang member or something like that. And then, they had a child and they, cleaned up their act and raised a child that was, better than themselves. That's possible. But to return to the example from Mumford that he cites about, there being no discernible weapons in certain Paleolithic archaeological sites, which suggests a lack of warfare or murder, I suppose. That would also suggest that they weren't aware of warfare. If you read Columbus's diary, he is expressing much the same thing upon his encountering, I think it must have been the Taino natives in Hispaniola, where he is describing how one of them expressed interest in the Spaniards' swords. And so the Spaniard handed the native his sword, and the native cut himself on it, cut his hand, because he didn't realize that it was a weapon. And he uses this as an example of how innocent and naive these people were, knowing no warfare. But once the hand is cut, and once you see the sword, or you even know of the sword's existence, or know that there is the concept of war, well, it's all over, isn't it? You're no longer innocent of that knowledge. And our proverbial cartel or gang member, would likely, his child is not going to grow up ignorant of these things. It's still a part of the culture. It's still a part of the world that we live in. I hope you get the point. Heinberg does not fall for the trick that espouses that human existence has been nothing but a trend of overall progress in a positive direction since we first started planting seeds in rows. This is suggested, at the very least, by his quoting of René Guénon on page 10. So he's had at least some exposure to the idea that the entire epoch that we have written down has been one of spiritual decline concomitant with technological progress, because Guénon hardly goes a paragraph without mentioning this. The problem may be that he was quoting from Guénon's Oriental Metaphysics, which he found in a compilation called The Sword of Gnosis, edited by Jacob Needleman in 1986. He might have done better to check out, at the very least, the first chapter of The Crisis of the Modern World, which is entitled The Dark Age, or all of his most famous book, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. But more relevant to his topic may have been traditional forms and cosmic cycles. So there seems to have been a disconnect there, where his question could have been answered or his conclusion could have been avoided. If you were wondering, I've been saving that carved area for last because I'm dreading the task, but I think that's enough sanding for now anyway. But this This was bothering me, so I checked his source. So what he quotes from Oriental metaphysics is as follows. The material prosperity of the West is incontrovertible, he wrote, but it is hardly a cause for envy. Indeed, one can go further. Sooner or later, this excessive material development threatens to destroy the West if it does not recover itself in time and if it does not consider seriously a return to the source. Whereas in the original, Guénon continues, indeed, one can go further. Sooner or later, this excessive material development threatens to destroy the West if it does not recover itself in time and if it does not consider seriously a return to the source, using an expression that is employed in certain Islamic esoteric schools. He has placed a period where Guénon had a comma, which is not especially egregious, but he has an incomplete picture of Islamic and even Abrahamic eschatology as a whole, preferring, I think, to point out the oppressions by the Christians towards other religions, and indeed lumps Islam along with everyone else who might be in that category of grievance. In other words, this book does what most New Age media does. It says that Jesus was a cool guy, but Christianity sucks. It assumes that there isn't a whole lot that is really valid, which has occurred in the millennia hence, when it comes to considering Christianity as a source of information. Then it mentions Sufism, but does not delve too far into anything Islamic, because it has really not very much exposure to anything Islamic. So it really doesn't know even where to begin, and ultimately assumes that the answer that it's looking for lies in a study of comparative mythology, such as this. And all of this is basically the standard play for New Age media. Quick detour, you may have noticed this inscription is in Latin, and of course you can't use Google Translate for Latin. It doesn't work very well at all. So I went to Joaquin at Signa Translations. There's a link in the description. Highly recommend, not sponsored by him or that company. It was just a great experience. So if I need anything translated to Latin or Greek, I think they do like Old English too. I'm just not even going to bother looking for anyone else. But you may have been wondering how the last heading was relevant to everything that I've been talking about, and assumed that there would be at least some reference to government, and that would be correct. Because this book, as I have been saying, is not all bad, and Heinberg does at least present, some worthwhile insight. On page 145, under the heading of Utopia, Paradise Made to Order, he describes again that conflict between our longing for paradise and our desire for stability, power, and domination, and says, most of history can be seen as a series of oscillations between periods of the relative dominance of one or the other of these two drives. And sometimes, as was the case in 1793 in France and again in 1917 in Russia, the oscillations can be so quick and violent that totalitarianism and indiscriminate slaughter are justified in the name of universal love and brotherhood. I'm not really convinced that that's the case. It could be said that is a valid explanation when describing the motives of the common people. But both of the examples that he gives, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, with the depth of research and the perspective that we have so many years later, it's pretty plain to see that the results and effects of both revolutions were quite a bit more calculated than it is presumed here. That is to say, both events were more cynically and greedily motivated, and the totalitarianism and indiscriminate slaughter were actually what was intended from the top down. But a few decades ago, that would not have been a popular thing to espouse, especially in the case of the French Revolution. But he does continue after that paragraph with a more interesting proposition. He says, "It is commonly thought that some forms of government are inherently paradisal or idealistic, while others are inherently oppressive. It is perhaps more reasonable to suggest that the influence of both the visionary and bureaucratic drives can be traced in every form of social order. Kingship, for example, originated as a way of commemorating the reign of the world king of the Golden Age, and the benevolent monarch was regarded as the conduit of the forces of life. But of course, in the hands of a megalomaniacal autocrat, the institution of kingship can serve instead the forces of death and oppression. Democracy also had idealistic beginnings as a means of realizing individual freedom and equality. According to the democratic ideal, human nature is fundamentally trustworthy, and given the opportunity, the majority of people will collectively make wise and just decisions. But in a democracy, there is always the danger that the nation will tend morally and intellectually toward its lowest common denominator, leading to control by powerful special interests and clever demagogues. Which is basically the situation that we have today. We are in basically a moral and intellectual free fall. And it's... anyone with half a clue is basically wondering when we are going to hit the floor of this seemingly bottomless pit. Clever demagogues. This was written in the Reagan era, which seems almost like a golden age to us now, whether you like Reagan or not. I mean, we're living in a time when it's possible to find some liberals expressing sentimentality for the Bush era. Things have gotten so bad. And this isn't a commentary on Reagan or Bush or Trump or any individual, because these people and these eras are all really just stages of progressive decline. And I only mentioned those names because I started with Reagan and continued along that line. The other side is no less a factor. Now, when he mentions the world king of the Golden Age, of course, I can't help but think of Rene Guénon's King of the World. Let's see, I keep bringing up Guénon, but he keeps making me do it. Heinberg does include some mention of the Yuga cycle, both in the Vedic tradition and as expressed elsewhere, like the Maya tradition, for instance. But when I read what he writes about it, I can't help but get the feeling that it's just an incomplete summary. And it is a big undertaking to try to fit such a concept into one book with all the other stuff that's in there. And I can't fault him entirely, because while he would have benefited from reading these books that I've suggested, at the time they either possibly hadn't been translated or the translations weren't as popular as they are now. They weren't as well known. Now, what's so frustrating about all this is that he had in his hands one of the best possible sources of information about his topic, but it was one of the worst possible essays. And upon reviewing Oriental metaphysics again, I realized that I was wrong in my assumption, and in fact, it is one of the few times that Guénon is not going on about the general decline. Heinberg is aware of it. He's aware of this idea, so There are really only two possibilities here. Either one, he quoted from Oriental metaphysics because he wasn't aware, didn't have access to really the rest of the corpus, or two, he did so in a disingenuous attempt to shoehorn in a New Age type conclusion on top of all of the research that he had done. And I don't think that it can really be the latter, because he just does not strike me as a dishonest person. If you read his book, he's very sincere and very, very candid about many of these ideas. And I just have to chalk it up to an unfortunate disconnect. So again, he hasn't fallen into the trap of believing that the successive forms of government have signified, nothing but progress, and that's not even necessarily a mainstream belief. You have, the Athenian democracy, and then so many centuries of, tyranny in various forms after that. But as a general idea, people have accepted this notion of progress, and that also ports over to the New Age. And now in the mainstream, you have things like the quote from Winston Churchill, and democracy is the worst form of government, except for all of the others that have been tried. And similar expressions of the belief that democracy, or true democracy, or a return to true democracy, or the development of some kind of better democracy will be what saves us, and that will be like utopia, or just the elimination of government. Now, again, the problem with all this is that it assumes that we will be the ones, or people like us will be the ones who implement this other superior form of government, or find a way to live peacefully in some kind of prosperous anarchy. And it's I don't know what else to say about it, except that it is obviously just a simple delusion. But maybe I'm just getting tired. Now, an objection to the apparent opposition that I've been discussing between the Abrahamic religions and Christianity especially, and this idea of a potential resurgence of a golden age, is that this corresponds to the millennial reign of Christ. Well, these two things can appear to be the same, but when the New Age types refer to the New Age, it tends to be either without reference to Christianity or the Abrahamic religions in total, or they tend to pay lip service to that same idea, or they appropriate Jesus as being just another philosopher or spiritual master, or any of this type of thing that they come up with. So even if it may appear to be congruent with the Christian scheme of things, it's not really what they're talking about. And I should mention that, as I was talking about before, in both Christian and Islamic eschatology, the return of Jesus is preceded by some rather nasty business, in which we are not all holding hands and singing along to our bongos. But for our final selections from this book, I will read much of the last part of it after he has been talking about Joseph Campbell's scheme of the hero's journey, and I assume that basically everyone is familiar with that by now. He's talking about the stage of fighting the dragon, or whatever it may be, and ultimately that dragon has to be defeated within us, he says. Once the dragon is recognized as being an internal force, a different kind of battle begins. This stage of the process in which the hero is wrestling with his own inner demons doesn't seem especially paradisal. It involves the exposure of one's weaknesses and the surrender of personal attachments. Paradoxically, it seems, one can only get to paradise by being willing to go through hell. But this conflict, too, must come to an end. The resolution of the battle with the inner demon is represented in the story of Jesus' temptations in the wilderness. Before Jesus began his public ministry, and after he had fasted in the wilderness for 40 days, the devil appeared to him. The devil first offered Jesus bread, symbolizing personal fulfillment at the physical level. Then he challenged Jesus' authority, and finally he offered the kingdoms of the world, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. But Jesus, refusing physical desire, the need to prove himself, and personal ambition as motives for his behavior, replied, "Get thee hence, Satan." For him, the demon was gone. And then, in true comparative fashion, he relates a similar story of the Buddha. Says that while he was sitting under the Bodhi tree, immediately before attaining enlightenment, he was tempted by the god demon Mara. Amid both violence and offers of pleasure and power, he simply sat and remained calm, like a lion seated in the midst of oxen. Mara and his armies, frustrated, left in defeat. And of course, if you're a fan of 90s television shows, you may remember how in Highlander, Duncan MacLeod defeated the demon Ahriman by running through some meditative kata, focusing on his breathing and giving a nice little speech, and not fighting. Trying to fight it is what got Richie beheaded. So after confronting the dragon and defeating it by not fighting it outwardly, but inwardly through peace and the expression, he says again, expressing the character of innocence and love. Suddenly, he says, the hero realizes that paradise has been there all along, unnoticed. And he continues, even after the hero has momentarily achieved paradisal awareness, he must still learn to sustain and communicate that state. From this point on, he is certain that he has known the true and natural condition of human consciousness, the pearl of great price, for which the wise person will sell everything. Matthew 13:46. After having developed the ability to consistently maintain paradisal consciousness, the hero returns to the mundane world with a healing balm. Having found heaven, he must share it, which means sharing himself, his state of being. For the individual, the return is the culmination of the journey, but the quest is not complete until the world has been restored. And that is the end of the book before the epilogue, the end of which I quoted earlier. Now, when it comes to maintaining that state, he would have benefited from a study of the maqamat. A maqam is a spiritual station that is reached in Sufism, you might say. And there is much discussion, including by Al-Ghazali, and even in Al-Ghazali's popular English book, Al-Ghazali's Path to Sufism, that is not in English. It was translated by McCarthy, published, I think, around 2000. It was a very popular book and translated into English, and towards the end there is some discussion of this, but again, Islamic sources are scamped throughout this text. You could have just ended it there, but there's a fork that occurs here. There are the doctrinal believers who will take the example of Jesus and follow Christianity, and then there's the Islamic conception of things. And in that sense, they would attempt to emulate the prophets and accept their teachings, which do not include any New Age ideas of creating utopia. Then there are those believers, as tenuous as their belief may be, that this is yet one example, which can be lumped in with the Buddha or Duncan MacLeod, or another example would be, the Fifth Element is probably a more popular portrayal of that idea. And that if we all did that somehow, then we could usher in this golden age, or that some believe that it will happen through some cosmic phenomenon, and we will be forced to drop all of our hatreds and our violence and everything else that from which we suffer these days. And then there are those who are kind of in between, but really much closer to the doctrinal interpretation, which is the people who take these examples and believe that this is really the best that any individual can do is to follow this type of example. And they would tend to really be more in the religious camp anyway, but there are some like Evola, who, of course, wrote, Ride the Tiger. And riding the tiger, of course, is the concept of standing in opposition to the modern sickness, being one of Devi's men against time. But even then, that we can see after nearly a century that doesn't really get you very far, I think. The people who have been able to do this are either prophets, like the example of Jesus, or otherwise holy men or people who are exceptionally gifted in a spiritual sense. This is not really presented as something that will plausibly be achieved by everybody. So there's another problem with the New Age in general. Now, I hope that I haven't sounded too critical about the book itself. Rather, my complaints are really about the New Ageism in general. I would probably recommend this book if you were looking for more information about this idea of a golden age having occurred in the past, and you're looking for more sources from mythology on that topic. It is a good resource. It was also written almost 40 years ago. So that if it had been written today, the content and some of the conclusions may have shifted a little bit. We have the benefit of hindsight over the last couple of decades, which have been pretty insane, even compared to the 80s. So it is worth a read, but as with anything like this that is not authoritative, you do need to have developed a filter. Now, on the with reference to the time that has passed, this book is very much a product of its time. There were a lot of books like this, and of those books, I would say that this is probably the best or among the best. And they tended to be published, between the 60s and early 2000s. There are maybe some exceptions, and there might be some more recent New Agey type books, but that was really the golden age of this type of publishing, and I think there was a reason for that. That was before 9/11, the global war on terror and everything that happened along with that, and after it up to the present. And people were a bit more optimistic. If you're a Zoomer or Gen Alpha, then you simply don't remember what things were like before 2001 and how much things changed. That era was more conducive to media like this being published and bought and read. In some way, for many of us, childhood was something like a golden age. And for the reasons I've described, that's something that we can't exactly return to. It has been remarked by, probably many people that the elderly, in some cases, revert to something like a more childlike state. And that could be said to be something like a return to their own personal golden age. But in another sense, and there I was finally sanding that, in another sense, most of us will be able to recall some time in our lives which we now perceive as being better than what we are experiencing now. If you're wondering about the finish, I'm sealing it with epoxy. I'm pretty sure that because this wood is just so weak, it's going to need the extra strength from an epoxy finish. And I'll put a top coat of polyurethane on it. But anyway, now that I've had a few months to reflect on this job that we had together, despite how terrible it often was for so many reasons, I find myself remembering, well, the good times. And this is a natural human tendency, unless something especially traumatic has occurred and we just don't want to think about it at all. We tend to reflect on things more or less positively, which says something fundamental about our nature. And I guess it is true what Meister Eckhart said about the divine spark being the possession of all of us. Now, as to an actual historical golden age, of course, if you're a doctrinal believer in, well, basically any religion, then this would be an article of faith for you. But as to its precise nature and character and the events that led to its ending, well, that will differ according to different groups of people, and whether or not it can come about again, well, I think I've said enough about that for now. But if there was a golden age, and I believe there was something like that, then this Metasequoia would have been around for it. And here it is again, still persisting, and unlike so many other species, it persists in the form or that it had millions of years ago. Are we the only species that had such a golden age? How many golden ages might the Metasequoia have seen remaining unchanged? Which puts it in a pretty exclusive club among alligators, mosquitoes, and a few other organisms. But that this tree was, according to our perception, resurrected and is now being planted in, I think, a park in the Carolinas and elsewhere. It's being used for landscaping. It was all over the northern hemisphere, nearly went extinct, rediscovered in China, and is now being propagated by us. We didn't have anything to do with its near extinction, but here we are, enabling it to repropagate. And it really is a nice looking tree. And there might be some things to consider in all that. Now, I've spent about an hour trashing wooey New Age beliefs, but I'm just going to tell you that I think trees are conscious. And I don't care what you think about it. Now, even if you don't believe that, entertain the idea for a minute and consider what time would feel like to a tree such as this if it had a collective memory, that is the memory of the entire species. We only have that through oral traditions and written history, but what if it had some sense of everything that has occurred throughout its entire existence? How would it have perceived these cycles, this golden age, or possibly these golden ages, if you believe in this cyclical pattern as the Vedic religion and the Maya do? How would it have experienced these events at the time, and how would it reflect upon them? It must, I think, be similar to how we experience time, but perhaps in a more drawn out way. Because time, we can measure time with a clock and watch the seconds advancing, But even the mechanisms that we devise to measure time are subject to the underlying physics, and we know that time is not constant. People say time is an illusion. Well, the constancy of time is also an illusion. And people can say time is variable, time is relative. I prefer to think of it as time precipitates. It's sort of like the weather, the rain, the snow. It falls at a pace, and the pace changes. And so when I put this epoxy finish on, and that's clear, and I also wanted the epoxy not just for the strength, but because it is clearer and will alter the color a bit less. Of course, I wiped off the excess like you're supposed to, and it dripped down the sides, and I scraped that off like you're supposed to, but then on the third coat, I watched it dripping, and I thought about time and how old this tree is, or this species is. And it reminded me of time precipitating and this tree experiencing that through the eons. So I left the drips. And the recipient of this said it makes it look a bit less natural, but it's not bad. So I kept them. And you'll see that in the pictures here shortly. But before that, I will leave you with a quote from one of the books I mentioned that I wish Heinberg had cited himself, The King of the World, in which he quotes Joseph de Maistre. We must be ready for an immense event in the divine order, which we are traveling toward, with an accelerated speed that must astound all those who watch. Redoubtable oracles have already announced that the time has arrived. And if you were looking for a band name, Redoubtable Oracles is probably your best option.